The next unit of the course will explore moral philosophy. Moral philosophy has something important in common with epistemology. Just as epistemologists study how you should reason, in particular, how you should reason if you're interested in believing true things and not believing false things, moral philosophy studies how you should act, in particular, how you should act if you aim to act rightly and not act wrongly. Here's a rough outline of the areas we'll investigate. We'll start off by distinguishing between two different questions we could be exploring when we explore moral philosophy. Then we'll look at those two questions. One is, where does morality come from? And the other, I write guidelines here, please, but the relevant question is, what are the correct moral rules or guidelines, not as a list, but in sort of general form? What is virtue, is a way Socrates might have put the question. Okay, so let's start off with these two questions. And what I want you to see here is that there are two very distinct and importantly distinct kinds of questions we can ask about morality. So first up, suppose we have this person in green say torturing others for fun is immoral. And the person in maroon agrees and says, yes, it's immoral. Now the person in green says, but killing people for fun, that's good. And the person in maroon says, wait, what? That doesn't seem right. It says it's false. And what I want you to notice straight away is that seems pretty intuitive, right? It seems pretty intuitive that it's just true that torturing others for fun is immoral, and it's just false that killing people for fun is morally good. Now, maybe at the end of the day, after some reflection and investigation, we'll decide that moral claims don't actually have truth values, the truth values being true and false. So moral claims can't actually be true and false. But at first glance, if you just watch people's ordinary conversation, people often treat moral claims as if they can be true or false. Okay? So let's just suppose for now that we're right to do that. That is, that some moral claims are true and others are false. Or if you don't like truth and falsity, talk of truth and falsity in relation to morality, we might say some moral claims are correct and others are incorrect. Some moral claims are appropriately assertable and others aren't. Basically, there's valence here. There's some moral claims that are broadly good or true or reasonable, and there's others that are broadly bad or false or unreasonable. Well, suppose we think moral claims have this kind of valence. That raises, and we'll just talk about truth and falsity, that raises a question. And the question is, what makes true moral claims true and false moral claims false? And this question is importantly ambiguous, and both of the questions that we're going to investigate you can think of as versions of this question, or ways to disambiguate the question, ways to apply an appropriate interpretation. Now, I suppose most of you know what ambiguity is, but in case anybody doesn't, take the word bank. If I say I went fishing at the bank last week, you would know I was talking about a river bank. If I said I withdrew money from the bank last week, you would know I was talking about a lending institution. The word bank can be used to refer to a riverbank, or it can be used to refer to a lending institution. And those are just two different meanings of the same word. And the point here is that this question has two very different interpretations. So let's make this clear. So suppose somebody says, what makes true moral claims true and false moral claims false? And this person here replies and says, well, I think it's facts about culture. What the person is saying is not, here's a general moral rule or guideline, right? This saying facts about culture doesn't really tell you how you ought to behave. What the person is saying is, this is kind of the source of morality. This is where morality comes from, right? Morality comes from culture. That's an assertion. I'm not saying it's the correct assertion. It's what that person is asserting. And this person over here disagrees and says, no way, it's facts about human nature. So one person says culture is the source of morality. Another says human nature is the source of morality. And you might provide other answers too, like you might say God is the source of morality. Or you might say morality is irreducible. There is no source. It's a basic part of the fabric of the universe. All of those answers, facts about culture, human nature, God, and so on, are attempts to say, here's where morality comes from. Here's the ultimate source of morality. Now over here, you're going to have answers to a very different interpretation of this same question. So this person in yellow might say, whether a moral claim is true or false depends on how it affects happiness. Actions that increase happiness are good, actions that decrease happiness are bad. And what the person in yellow is doing is offering kind of a general moral guideline. The person is saying, look, we should measure the moral value of an action in terms of its consequences, and good consequences are those that increase happiness, and bad consequences are those that decrease happiness. This kind of principle would help you evaluate any particular action as morally good or morally bad, but it wouldn't tell you where morality comes from in the first place. Here we have Orange, and Orange offers a competing answer. Orange says, no, it's not, that action that increases happiness is good and one that decreases happiness is bad. Instead, actions are good if they follow the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and they're bad if they violate that rule. Well, again, this doesn't tell you like what makes the golden rule worth paying attention to. It doesn't tell you what makes the golden rule important. It just says the golden rule is kind of the most general moral principle. Now, notice over here, it's the opposite. It doesn't tell you how to act. It doesn't tell you what the most general moral rule or principle is. It just tells you whatever the principle is, here's where it comes from. It comes from culture, or it comes from human nature. So when we ask what makes true moral claims true and false moral claims false, there's two very different things we could be asking. We could be asking what are the most kind of general moral principles, and that's what these guys over here are answering. Or we could be asking what is the ultimate source of morality, not what the principles are, but where do the principles themselves come from? And that's what these gals over here are answering. Now, over here, you might disambiguate the question by saying, what are the most general moral rules or guidelines? And that's what these folks are answering. And over here, you might say, whatever the guidelines are, what makes those rules or guidelines the right ones? And that's what these folks are answering. So two very different questions. Now, sometimes answers to one question can also be answers to the other, and that can leave people a bit confused. But let's look at some answers that look like they're very distinctive. So suppose over here you say, what are the most, what makes, whatever the right rules and guidelines are, what makes them right? You might say the law. That is, morality is nothing but the law. So when people talk about a higher law, they're making a mistake. All there is human-made law, and that's what morality is. The limits of bad behavior are the limits of illegal behavior. Or you might say, no. There's complex moral rules and guidelines embedded into culture, and it's the culture itself that makes them correct. So in one culture, you'll have one set of moral rules and guidelines. In another culture, you'll have another set of moral rules and guidelines. And it's not like they're in competition. They're just different sets of moral rules and guidelines, each appropriate to its culture, because there's no deeper morality each of them is trying to reflect. Or you might say, no, there is a deeper morality, and it comes from human nature. That is, there's facts about, say, human psychology, how humans are built, that make morality what it is, that make true moral claims true and false ones false. Whatever the true moral claims are, whatever the right general principles are, it's facts about how we're built that make the right ones right and the wrong ones wrong. And then they cross-cut cultures. Every culture should have the same ones because every human has the same nature in the relevant respect. Or you might say, no, morality comes from God. Killing others for fun is wrong because God says it's wrong. If God had decided otherwise, it would have been fine, but that's what God said. So God is the ultimate source of morality. Again, that won't tell you what the right principles are. It won't say, here's the general principles. It will just say, whichever ones God says they are, those are the right ones. And then you'd have to figure out what God says in order to figure out what the right ones are. Another possible proposal is meaning. You might say, just like some statements have their truth values, just like the statement sisters or siblings has its truth value determined by its meaning, that is, the meaning of sisters or siblings is enough to make it true, you might think, so the meaning of killing others for fun is immoral is enough to make it true. You might think it's right there in the meaning of the expressions that that claim is true, and it's right there in the meaning of the expression killing others for fun is good that that claim is false. Or you might think that there are moral entities. Now this one people sometimes have trouble getting their head around. We'll talk about it a bit later. But the basic idea here is that there's genuine moral features in our world, just like there's colors and shapes and sizes, just like there's electrons and protons, just like there's hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms, and so on and so forth. There's moral entities. There's moral properties, and some behaviors instantiate the goodness ones, and some behaviors instantiate the badness ones. And another possibility is that there are no true moral claims. So the attempt to find morality as the source of morality is deeply misguided because really moral claims aren't the kind of things that can be true or false. Maybe they don't even have valence. They're not even appropriate or inappropriate. They're just nonsense. Over here on the other side, we're going to have very different kinds of proposals. So we might say the most general moral rule or guideline is maximize happiness for all. Now notice if I said, whatever the right principles are, what makes them right, and you replied, maximize happiness for all, that would make no sense. But if I said, whatever the right principles are, what makes them right, and you said, culture is what makes them right, that would make sense, or human nature, or God, or whatever. Whereas if I said, what are the most general moral rules or guidelines, and you said, God, well, that wouldn't tell me anything because I would need to know what God says. And if you say, what are the most general moral rules or guidelines, and I say, culture, again, that doesn't tell you anything because you need to know what each particular culture says. Okay, so in response to the question, what are the most general moral rules or guidelines, there's a variety of proposals. One, maximize happiness for all. Another, maximize happiness for me. This is called moral egoism. The idea is I should just pursue my own happiness, and that's really the morally right thing to do for me. And the right thing for you to do is to pursue your own happiness. Each of us should aim at our own happiness. Another possibility is you should follow the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. As long as you're following that rule, you're behaving morally. When you're violating that rule, you're behaving immorally. Another possibility is that you should act as the virtuous person would. So the idea here is we should form some ideal of a virtuous person and just try and sort of emulate that person, do what that person would do in any given situation. Another possibility is you should follow the law. So if the claim on the left here that law is the ultimate source of morality and the only immoral actions are ones that are illegal and that all legal actions are morally equally good, equally acceptable, suppose you have that view, then when you want to find the right moral rules or guidelines, you just need to find the law for your society and don't do the things that are illegal, and you're free to do whichever things are legal, morally speaking, free. Okay, and another possibility is that there are no moral rules or guidelines. Obviously, that would follow if moral claims, if there's no source of morality, if it has no, moral claims really don't have any valence, any goodness or badness, rightness or wrongness, truth or falsity to them. The questions on the left are exploring what's called meta-ethics, and the questions on the right are exploring what's called normative ethics. And you've probably heard the word meta used this way. It's to talk about like the next step up. So the idea is you answer, here's what the correct moral rules or guidelines are, and maybe you settle on the answer that you should follow the golden rule. That's the most general moral principle. Then somebody could say, well, what makes that the right principle? And once you've identified the principle, your job in normative ethics is done. You've said, here's how, the principle you should follow in determining how to act. But when someone says, what makes that the right principle, you now have to do some meta-ethics. And you have to say, well, it's part of human nature says you should follow the golden rule, or all cultures agree on that, or the law says that, or whatever it may be. Okay, so when we ask this question this way, where does morality come from? What we're asking is this meta-ethical question. Whichever moral rules or guidelines are correct, what makes them correct rather than some other guidelines or no guidelines at all? Okay, that's the next question we'll ask. And we're going to stop this video there. The point of this video is to get distinct on these two interpretations of this question so that we can then pursue this question in the next sequence and this question in subsequent sequences. Okay, we'll stop there.